Miranda James is the pseudonym of Dean James, a seventh generation Mississippian recently returned home after 30 years in Texas. A mystery fan since the age of 10, he wrote his first novel at the ripe old age of 12. The only copy of The Mystery of the Willow Key vanished years ago, but since it was highly derivative of the Nancy Drew and Trixie Belden mystery series, that's probably a good thing. Currently a librarian in the University of Mississippi Medical Center in Jackson, Dean has published articles or topics in library science, the history of science medicine, and mystery fiction. His first book, which he co-wrote with fellow librarian Jean Swanson, was By a Woman's Hand, Berkeley, 1994. Jean and Dean won an Agatha Award for Best Mystery Nonfiction and were nominated by the Mystery Writers of America for the Edgar for Best Critical Biographical Work for this popular reference book. A second edition followed 2 years later, and Dean and Jean collaborated on two further projects, Killer Books, Berkeley, 1998, and The Dick Francis Companion, Berkeley, 2003. In all, he has co-authored or co-edited 6 works of mystery reference and 1 short story anthology. However, I would say he's probably best known for his Cat in the Stack mysteries, and I think you've had 17. Am I correct in that number?
Yeah, number 17 came out, or I was going to say earlier this year, but back in July.
Yes. So
Yeah,
a very warm welcome
thank
to
you.
Dean James. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Amy. It's nice to see you all. And just one correction to my biography, which I really need to get my web person to fix, is I've been retired for well, a little over 2 years now. No, 3 years. Yeah, 3 years now. And let me tell you, retirement is wonderful. Although I have found it so much easier to be lazy. I got more done when I had a full-time job, but that's what happens. But anyway, as Amy told you, I've loved mysteries, since I was a kid. I think I discovered Nancy Drew when I was about 10, and I've never looked back. My first one was The Secret of Shadow Ranch, and that was the revised one with the ghost horse on the cover. And I made my way through Nancy and the Hardy Boys and Terry Ames and Dickie Barr, and Trixie was another beloved favorite. Judy Bolton. I mean, and I have a huge collection of those books. I never let go of any of my Nancy Drew books. They've been with me for over 50 years. So anyway, but that's where I learned to love mysteries. And of course, as I got older, I branched out of it. I began to read Agatha Christie, and my preference has always mostly been for English mysteries because I'm a devout Anglophile. And when I did my DNA on Ancestry and 23andMe.com, surprise, surprise, I came up, like 95%, from the British Isles, with a little mixture from other places. So it was definitely in my blood. But and I also, about the age of 12, figured out, well, somebody has to write these books. They don't just magically appear somewhere. So I thought, well, I want to do that. I want to write one, and as a Southerner, we always love to tell stories. So I came up with a story as Amy mentioned. And I actually, one of my aunts had a typewriter, so she typed it up. I mean, it was actually barely even a novella. It was so short. And I sent it to the Trixie Belden publisher, and I got back a very, kind of slightly worn-looking mimeographed rejection letter. And that killed my little writer's heart, so I didn't really try writing again until I was in college. And particularly when I got to grad school in Houston at Rice. And I wrote over that one summer when I was house sitting for my advisor while she and her husband were in Europe for 7 weeks. I wrote a book that was based loosely on the history department at Rice University. It was eventually published in 2005 as Death by Dissertation, but it took 20 years to get it published. But I tell people, there's not necessarily a correlation between being a graduate student and killing a professor, but make of that what you will. Anyway, as Amy said, I was in Houston for actually 33 years, and 30 of those years I spent working at Murder by the Book in Houston. So some of what I will have to say comes from a triple perspective as a fan, as a bookseller, and as a writer, because I have a lot of experience selling mysteries, and I will tell you that in times like these when there's unrest and uncertainty, people tend to turn more to comfort reading than they do to thrillers. In the wake of 9/11, I mean, we could hardly sell a thriller. And a Houston author had a debut, big splash debut from a major publisher, and he was out of town, and he was hardly able to get back to Houston in time for his signing. But thrillers just tanked. Even some big names didn't sell that well because people were not wanting to read conspiracy theories and stuff like that. They wanted something more comforting. And I think one of the reasons that people do read, especially cozies, is they want a world that makes sense. And in a cozy, there is a conclusion, there is justice served because the killer is identified. You won't find ambiguous endings in a cozy. And frankly, it's difficult to do an uncertain ending uh, and make it work. I mean, the best example I can think of is Minette Walters' book, The Sculptress. If you ever want to read a book with an ambiguous ending, that is a brilliant one. But as I said, cozies bring comfort. The structure is comforting because the thing about a cozy is to make them work properly. And there goes Bird on the top of the chair. Um, for them to work properly, it has to be sort of in a closed setting. And my chief model in my writing has always been Agatha Christie. And if you're going to write cozies and you haven't read Christie, well, then you need to do that because she was a master at plotting and structure and timing. I mean, her short stories are brilliant because the ideas in them are perfect for short stories, and she executes them beautifully. But other writers like Marjorie Allingham happens to be my very favorite mystery writer of all. But Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy Sayers, Niall Marsh, Michael Ennis, Rex Stout. I mean, people don't really think of him as cozy, but there's not really any explicit violence, except maybe when Archie gets beat up or he beats up somebody. you know. But Rex Stout, is always that enclosed world of, well, not always, but most of the time of that brownstone and the area of New York and everything. And I think that gives comfort to people because it's a world they can relate to. And the other thing is, how many of us are homicide detectives or judges? Yes, occasionally there will be one who writes mysteries, but the main character in a cozy most often is an amateur, somebody like you or me. And we don't live on the mean streets. And I don't really feel comfortable about writing about the mean streets, although I would kind of like to write a darker book. But, we see people like ourselves in these books, and we see them coping with these situations, and we see them problem solving and learning to do that. And I think that's one reason why people um, identify with these books. And of course, you always get I make jokes about the Jessica Fletcher syndrome. It's like, if you saw this woman coming at your front walk, would you open the door? No, because somebody's going to get killed. Why would you let her in your house? But in Cabot Cove, so many people got killed in Cabot Cove and elsewhere. But you have to, I think, writing cozies, you have to allow for what Coleridge called the willing suspension of disbelief. No, I mean, I will never get involved in a murder investigation, as far as I know, even though I have some of the detective skills to do so. But people like to live vicariously. I mean, that's what I mean. I visited all kinds of places with Nancy Drew and the other detectives who went to, Nancy went to Africa and she went to Peru and she went to Scotland and the Hardy Boys went all over the place. Nancy went to Hawaii, and I finally did go to Hawaii, thank goodness. But they we experience a different kind of life when we read these books. And, we can sort of, especially if they're written in the first person, you can kind of put yourself in the narrator's place and say, okay, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And I think people get a kick out of that. I mean, I have written cozies, I've written 2 series in the third person, but it's always the fixed third person viewpoint. And, which is a challenge in some ways, but, it could work. But again, those characters give the reader, a little frisson of danger, and you can pit your wits against the villain, try to figure these things out. I try my best to come up with a good puzzle every time and have, various suspects with different motives and everything. But, I will never ever be Agatha Christie. I mean, nobody ever will be. Although there are people who are masterful at plots and things these days. Anne Cleves is absolutely brilliant. If you have not read her Shetland books or her Vera books or her new series with Matthew Venn, I mean, I recommend them highly. I mean, she's absolutely brilliant. And they're somewhat they're on the cozier side because she doesn't dwell in the grisly details. I mean, you don't actually watch the doctor do an autopsy, like you do in Patricia Cornwell. And I gave up on Cornwell after 2 books, frankly. Ugh. Anyway, and plus she's a squirrel. Sorry, having met her several times, she just got increasingly bizarre. So, and that's one of the things from being a person that Murder by the Book. We hosted so many writers, so many famous writers, and most of them were lovely people, but the ones who were stinkers were real stinkers. And one of them is dead, so I can now tell you about him. Stuart Woods was awful, really awful. So anyway, I sort of got off the trail there because I do like to gossip, as you might add. And please feel free to interrupt with questions. I mean, I can babble for hours, and you sometimes may need to repoint me. I actually have a little outline here. Let me look at it again. Let's see. And I started writing mysteries, because I love them so much. And I always tell people, write what you really like. If you're trying to write to a trend and you don't particularly like those books, then you're not really going to do it well. You need to write what entertains you, because if you're spending all this time with these characters and this problem, you need to be invested in it as someone who enjoys what they're writing. I could not write a really bloody book because it would be an awful mess. As much as I would love to occasionally, but I can think of one thriller I'd really love to write now about the murder of, most of the cabinet in Washington, D.C. But, be a mass murderer. But anyway, but I love writing mysteries because I like the challenge of coming up with the plot, coming up with a basic idea. And I don't start a book until I have, a basic idea and usually a title. Because I'm one of those weird people. I like to have a title before I actually start writing. And sometimes the title will inform the plot. Like the book before last was called Requiem for a Mouse. And I thought, it was fairly clear what that meant. But I've had a number of people ask me because the murder victim in the book is kind of portrayed as a mousy character, deliberately. And she's trying to sort of hide, and the solving of the mystery is kind of a requiem for this poor woman who was murdered. That seemed obvious to me, but it wasn't. So, and that's one of the things that happens to you sometimes, things you think are perfectly obvious, aren't they? So, where I get my ideas, who knows? I do not have that handy, book of ideas. I'll occasionally write things down. And, in one book, I'm trying to remember, Arsenic and Old Books. That actually was an old idea I'd had years before. And it got switched around a little bit. But, an old Civil War diary in current politics and, an ambitious family, who'd been Confederates in the Civil War and stuff. That suggested that very quickly, and it developed very quickly. The one I'm supposed to be writing right now, is called is A Little Town of Homicide, and it's going to be set at Christmas time, and it's going to involve a church pageant, gone bad. And then if you've ever been involved in these things, you know that you know groups at church can never quite get along because everybody wants something different. So, at least in my experience, growing up in a small church. And anyway, but for various reasons, I've not really been able to focus on writing. And so there's not going to be a book this year, but because just various things I'm not going to bore you with. But, various things can, inspire an idea. I mean, one book, I really wanted to get back at two people in my last library job in Houston who I despised and who engineered, my getting fired along with several other people. And I wanted to kill them, you know. Sue Grafton killed her first two ex-husbands in her books, one in A and one in B. So I thought, if Sue can do it, I can do it. And a Golden Age writer named Christiana Brand famously killed someone she did not like in her first book too. So, it happens. And actually, one of the people I'm talking about, I killed twice. Once I pushed her down the stairs, and once I ran over her with a car. The other one, who was my last immediate boss at the Medical Center Library, I squeezed to death between compact shelving in the library, which technically you really can't do because there are safety features. But I thought, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway because he was actually a sociopath, which I found out. And, he was awful. And so those ideas spurred various things. Let's see, Catherine is asking a question. I can't read all of it. Let me see.
I can help you if you need. Diesel is accepted almost everywhere. What do you think of service and emotional support animals? Would Diesel ever be certified as one?
I don't really see him as that. I mean, in the beginning, he was because Charlie was grieving over his wife and his great aunt and everything. But I think service animals are wonderful, and I think people need to get over it, about animals, and especially animals coming into restaurants. It's not like they're going to get up and shake their fur in your food or pee on your foot, or on the plane. It's just ridiculous. Now, I would not be comfortable with uh, a a service animal that was a snake because I'm deathly afraid of snakes, big spiders. So there are limits, in service animals, when I worked in the medical center, there was this one doctor who was in a wheelchair, and he had a service dog that went everywhere with him, and I saw them frequently. And while I think sometimes it can be a burden on the animals if they're overworked, but for the most part, I think it's wonderful. Uh, and and in the circumstances, when Charlie found Diesel, he'd been abandoned, and I actually never figured out why he was abandoned and who had it. But anyway, I in Arsenic and Old Lace, Old Books, excuse me, there's a, a a short story about how Charlie found Diesel. So, because people kept asking me, well, how did you find him? So I answered that there. But Charlie, is an icebreaker for one thing. And most people are going to, because when we started this journey, Charlie and I were the same age, about 50. And I am currently 11 years older than him now, because it's about 3 books to a year. So he's about 55, going on 56 now. And if I can do it long enough, he may eventually catch up to me. But I'll be 67 this summer, so he's got a way to go. But like I said, Charlie's an icebreaker, and people I think fell in love with the series because of Diesel. And I actually borrowed Diesel from the late Barbara Mertz, whom you may know as Elizabeth Peters, Barbara Lyons. One time when a friend and I were visiting Barbara at her home in Maryland, and Barbara always had cats and dogs, usually more cats than dogs. And we looked up, and there was this large creature walking into the room that looked like a bobcat. And it was her Maine Coon, whose name was the Diesel. He was actually named for Washington Redskins running back, who was nicknamed the Diesel. I think his name was John Norris. But anyway, he was the gentlest, sweetest thing. He took a shine to my friend Beth, climbed in her lap, and did not get up. you know, and I don't know, when I thought about writing this series, I mean, he immediately came to mind, and that's why I named him Diesel. And some years later, Barbara joked that she was going to sue me for stealing her cat. But I think she got a real kick out of it. But and Joan Hess did too, because she's the one who told Barbara about it. Joan likes to stir up trouble. But anyway, I mean, people relate to Diesel, and we all know that cats and dogs can be sensitive to people with bad intentions. And for the most part, Diesel is a pretty good, uh, oh, what is the word? Weather vane, or whatever that word is, of people who are not necessarily good people. And you can always be suspicious. Once in a couple of times, he's been a little fooled, but usually you can tell. I give clues to some of the people who may not be so good, because Diesel doesn't want to go near them. And I think readers have picked up on that, and that may spoil some of my plots. I don't know, but anyway, that's a very long, uh, answer to your question, Catherine. Any other questions? Yeah. Well, let me see what else was I going to talk about. Well, I'm still on the ideas thing. Obviously, I got ideas because I wanted to kill two people, and enjoyed doing it. But I think the plots worked. And then, a lot of people are interested in my writing process. And of course, the first thing I tell people is there is no one right way to write a book. You have to figure what works for you. Because what I do, I really wouldn't recommend anybody, because I procrastinate a lot. And but I know that when I do get in the groove writing, and the book is flowing and everything, that it's going to work. But sometimes it takes me a while to get there. It takes me 100 pages or so just to get to the murder. Because for one thing, I want to give people a chance to dislike the murder victim, because I really enjoy killing obnoxious people in my books. And I think a lot of readers get satisfaction from that, because we've all dealt with these jerks in the workplace, in public, whatever. And honestly, sometimes if I could just push a button and they would disappear, I would do it, to spare us all misery. A lot of our elected officials in Mississippi would be gone if that were the case. But once you get the idea, what I do is, of course, by now I have continuing characters like Charlie's children and their spouses, and Charlie's grandkids, and Azalea the housekeeper, and Melba, his lifelong friend, and of course Helen Louise, who, spoiler alert, they get married between Requiem and Something Whispered. In Something Whispered, the latest book, they're on their honeymoon in Ireland, visiting Helen Louise's family. And for the first time ever, I have a dead body in the first chapter in that book. They come driving up to the family castle, and a body comes flying off the roof and lands in front of their car. So, and that was, I got that opening in my head right away. And then I had to figure out who it was and why and all those good things. And I do that to myself sometimes. I figure out, okay, this is what's going to happen. Now I need to figure out why and who, because I almost never know who the killer is to begin with. Because I like to entertain myself as I write the book and try to figure things out and say, oh, this person could have this motive, and this person could have that motive, and work that into the plot. And, I can be a slow writer to begin with, but then when I get about 125 pages in or so, and my books are around 350, 360 pages, double spaced. By that point, I'm sort of in the groove, and I start thinking about, okay, what else needs to happen to bring this plot to a conclusion? And a lot of times what I do is I take index cards and I will write plot points on them. And I can shuffle them around and say, okay, what's the logical order these things need to happen? And that helps me. It gives me the roadmap I need, you know. And and of course sometimes it changes because I'll think of a better idea or something. But it's very helpful. But I don't do that until I'm about, a third of the way into the book because I'm exploring the characters, letting them tell me who they are. Because I'm not like Elizabeth George or P.D. James, for example, who sits down and comes up with complete biographies for my characters. I mean, I frankly don't want to know that much about them. I want to know what I need to know for the book. And then I think if I'm doing my job properly, then the character reveals himself or herself to the reader, and they begin to understand what motivates them, everything. And the other thing, and what doing that helped me do years ago, was create a subplot. Because my early books had no subplot whatsoever; it was all just the main plot. And I knew I needed to add something, more to the books. And that method, because I could look, and I used to put them up on a bulletin board over my desk, um, helped me visualize where I could put in, you know, something character relatable that would, help people buy into the characters more and make them more relatable. And that was a big help for me because, I was trained as a historian. I went to grad school to be a history professor. And, and that kind of writing, I can't remember if it's left brain or right brain, but it's the kind of writing that is very analytical. You move from point A to point B to point C to point D to make your argument. And that's how my brain works. And that's how I write. I cannot write chapter 7 and then come back to chapter 3 and then jump to 14 and whatever. I mean, I can see that something's going to happen, but I'm not going to write it till I get there. Because by the time I get there, the idea might have changed a little bit. So I'm very, logical. And hopefully that helps with plotting. I don't always know. But that's more or less my process uh, in a nutshell. Like I said, I don't encourage anybody to procrastinate like I do because I tell people, and it's true, that creativity is like a muscle. I mean, you don't get on the treadmill once every 3 weeks and walk for 15 minutes and expect to get anything happen. It's the same thing with writing. You really need, when you're working on a book, you really need to do it every day. And it doesn't always mean sitting at the computer or the typewriter or writing longhand or whatever. But you get that because I also believe that your subconscious is a powerful helper in writing. If you get all that stuff sort of bubbling in your subconscious, then when you sit down, some of those things are going to come out in your writing. Because I'll find myself writing something that, oh, okay, I see now. And, I'm not trying to be psychic or anything, but it's just, your subconscious at work. And I think that is one of the greatest tools we can have as writers. You got to nurture that subconscious and you've got to feed it. And because I'm sure most of us, we have that moment when we're about to go to sleep where we think of something. And if we don't get up and write it down, it's gone. I have come up with some killer plot ideas that had vanished because I did not bestir myself and get up and write them down. So I need to learn to do that. But and it really helped when I was working full time because there was a period in my life where I was working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet because I had my parents to take care of and stuff. And my only writing time was really on the weekends. But I would spend, the week thinking about the book and letting it perk. And then on the weekend, I could write 40 pages easily, because it was all there wanting to come out. And I think now that I'm not working full time, I've allowed that process to sort of slow down because I really need to be busy with other things in order to make that work the way it used to. So I've got to find a way. What I need to do is go back to the gym for one thing. I stopped going during COVID and I've never gone back. But anyway, that's my sort of rambling discussion of how I work. And it has proved successful. I mean, I was writing for a long time before, this series became a hit. Because I published, let's see, 5, 7, 11 mysteries before this series. And, they all did okay, but, they didn't continue. 5 was the most books I had in one series. One series just had 2 because my editor left and I got kind of abandoned. And so I never really envisioned getting to book 17. And there will be at least 2 more. I got a contract for 2 more. And because Berkeley's only doing 2 book contracts now. The last one was for 4 books, which just blew my mind. But now they're being more cautious, especially because supposedly the mass market paperback is dead. But I can check into the Penguin Random House portal and see what my sales are on a weekly basis. And people are still buying paperbacks. When my books first come out in hardcover, though, they sell better as ebooks. And if you haven't read Something Whiskered and you do ebooks, beginning on Monday, it's going to be a BookBub selection for $1.99. So here's your chance to grab it. And I actually get, and most of you know this, you get better royalties on ebooks in general, depending on the publisher. You get way better royalties. I'm one of those people, you can see behind me, this is my office. And these are mostly nonfiction, like history and so forth. And if you look right back here, oops, what did I do? Anyway, that little picture on this side, that's me at 4 or 5. So anyway, okay.
We have 2 questions for you, Dean.
Sure.
One is from Trisha Hawkins. Can you give examples of subplots you've used in your books?
Oh, sure. In the first book, no, excuse me. Well, the second book in the series, Charlie's son, who was a corporate lawyer in Houston, shows up out of the blue and says, Dad, can I stay with you for a while? And it turns out he got fired from his job because he got involved with a female partner at a law firm and things did not go well. And so he got fired. Of course, she engineered his downfall, but she got mad at him and stuck him with her dog, who is a part of the family. And, Charlie's relationship with his son wasn't great because Charlie left Houston after his wife died. And of course, his daughter is in Hollywood, trying to make it as an actress. So the subplot there was Charlie trying to reestablish a good relationship with his son. And, that filtered through the plot. And because the main plot was about a book collector who had a family who there were leeches and stuff. And so, sometimes people ask you, well, what is it you actually write about? That serious literary question. What are you writing about? And it didn't take me long to figure out that I write about family. Pretty much every book, there's something to do with the family that isn't working properly or whatever. Or maybe they are, showing how they get along. And then the third book, Charlie's daughter shows up. She has taken a temporary job at the college where Charlie works in the drama department. And it just so happens that one of her old boyfriends has been invited, because he was a native of the town, to be the writer in residence. And he's really, really freaking obnoxious. And he gets murdered. And because Laura used to be involved with him, she's a suspect. And there's that whole story about Laura's life and everything. And so, there are different things in each one. But that's what, the character stuff, the family stuff, because these people have become integral parts of the story. And if I don't include Melba, and if I don't include Azalea, people get pissed at me. And people love Azalea. She's a composite of all the older Southern black and white women that I grew up with. And these are women you do not mess with. And Charlie in the beginning is a little bit afraid of Azalea because she was his aunt's housekeeper. And she told him she's not going anywhere because Miss Dottie asked her to look after the house and him. And of course, Charlie's chief antagonist in the books is Azalea's daughter, Kanisha, who is a deputy in the sheriff's department. And I found out from my cousin who's married to a sheriff's deputy in this county is that actually in a lot of counties, especially where they don't have a very big police force, it's the sheriff's department that investigates the murders. So Kenesha and Charlie butt heads, and that's sort of ongoing. Eventually, they work out a way to work together. But Azalea, I mean, Kenesha resents the fact that her mother's still working as a domestic, and Azalea is, retirement age, but she refuses to retire, and Charlie's not going to be the one who say, you need to go. So, and I mean, she reminds me so much of my great aunts and one of my grandmothers, and I love that character because she's part of my heritage in so many ways. Hopefully that answers that. The next question is, which do you prefer, writing novels or short stories? Well, I actually prefer writing novels because short stories can be extremely difficult. You have to have an idea that is just exactly right for like 20 pages or 25 pages. And I have written some short stories, which I'm very proud of. But, sometimes you just have to, pull the idea out of your soul, to make it work. And that's why I admire Agatha Christie and Ruth Rendell. I mean, Ruth Rendell, the late, great British writer, wrote brilliant short stories too. She wrote brilliant books as well. I'm a huge fan of hers. So I wish I could write a book like hers. I did write one short story that day. It was in an anthology called The Confederacy of Crime. And it had stories from all 13 of the Confederate states. And I represented Mississippi because John Grisham was too busy. So I got to write. And I really love that story. It's called The Perfect Gentleman. And it's about a very strange relationship between a mother and a son and how it goes wrong. It's my Southern Gothic, you know. So, and the other one I wrote was for an anthology called Delta Blues, which was the brainchild of Carolyn Haynes. And the stories had to have something to do with the Mississippi Delta and the blues because that's where the blues originated, was in the Mississippi Delta. And in that story, I based it on events in my own mother's life. She was forced into an abusive marriage at a young age by her father. And the man she married was not my dad, thank God. But I took that and embroidered it and turned it into a murder story. And I wrote it in one sitting. And I hardly changed a word. It just came out. And that is, I've never been more inspired to write a short story because I was writing something very personal today. And I've written other stories which I think were fun to write. I published about a dozen maybe, but I just find them harder to plot. And a short story has to have a good plot. I've read any number of literary short stories, and they can be entertaining, but it's like, okay, what happened here? I mean, I read a bunch of Ellen Gilchrist's short stories until I met her, and that put me off ever reading her again. But she wrote one about a woman who ordered a man from the LLB catalog, which was hilarious. Imagine ordering a man from a catalog. I mean, she made it really, really funny. She wrote some funny stories. It's just a shame she turned out to be such a, what. But I just find them hard. And that's probably more of an answer than you want. But anyway, because usually my ideas keep growing and I can't contain them, to make them a short story. So, yeah. Other questions?
I have one.
Okay.
19 books in a series. How do you keep each one feeling fresh and different from the last one and just keep that momentum going? That's a tremendous challenge.
It is, and I believe that I'm not really repeating myself with the plots. Although, as I said, there's usually something to do with family about them. But, there's character dynamics that change from book to book. And then also the characters that you create for your plot. You try to make them distinctive and different as well. And, I admit, after writing 17 books, number 18 is proving to be a challenge. Because I used to be writing other books in between. Because I wrote an offshoot series from these books about the Southern ladies, the Ducote sisters, who were the grand dames of this little town. And I started another one, even though I don't have a contract for it, because I keep getting requests for And I think writing, their story, and plus two of my previous series, which like my Gay Vampire in England and my Trailer Park Mom in Mississippi. I want to get back to all of them because people ask for them, But like I said, I've been really lazy. I could have published 4 or 5 books by now if I'd gotten out my rear end, But it is a challenge. But I think part of it is you go into it with a mindset, that this is going to be a unique story, and the characters are going to do different things, and yes, you include, people and items of things that people who love the series are going to recognize. Because, like I said, if I write, I mean, something whiskered was a little bit of a risk because I took them to Ireland. So there aren't any of the minor characters that people are used to. It's Charlie and Louise, Helen Louise, and Diesel, and then Helen Louise's relatives, basically, who these people don't know. So I think that, and I also took them to Asheville, North Carolina, a few books ago, mainly because I'd been to Biltmore and I wanted to use it in a book. And of course, you can write it off on your taxes when you do that. But you try to do different things. And honestly, taking Diesel out of Athena, it can be a little different. But I found out, it's much easier to bring pets to Ireland now. They relax their restrictions. So we might go back to Ireland. I don't know. Because I would love to go back myself. I love Ireland. And I would be living there now if I could afford it, frankly. But you just have to look at it as a new project with new territory and explore something a little different in each book, with your plot and your characters. I don't know if that's really helpful or not, but
That is.
that's what I try to do. So,
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? You could put them in the comments. I have a few others.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, go
Um,
ahead.
is there a series that you've been wanting to write, a book that you've been wanting to write that's been in your head for a while that you haven't gotten to? One that you
Oh
would
yeah.
like to share with us?
Yes, I want to write a series set in the Cotswolds about a character who is modeled on Margaret Rutherford. And if you don't know who Margaret Rutherford is, she was a wonderful British actress who was totally distinctive. She played Madame Arcady in the film version of Bly Spirits, and she also did 4 movies as Miss Marple. She was never Miss Marple in those books. She was Margaret Rutherford. I mean, Joni Hickson is the only person I think who's ever really been Miss Marple. But one of the characters is based on her. She's this, you know, wealthy writer who writes swashbuckling romances. And she hires a young woman with a mysterious past as her secretary. And the secretary is walking the dog and finds a dead body in the woods. She finds a hand with a ring on it, just a hand actually. And so that's how it starts. And I really would love to get back to that book because I mean, Margaret Rutherford, what's not to love?
I agree. Yeah, I'll pre-order it now. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, told me.
And that may be one of the things I do, yeah, in one of the breaks, yes. And somebody said, can you talk about how you do research for law enforcement? Oh, and multiple synonyms and settings. Okay. Settings, I've made up this little town, which is actually based on Oxford, Mississippi, because of the atmosphere of a university town. But it is not Oxford. It's influenced by Oxford. Because if I actually said it in Oxford, people would say, well, that store's not there anymore. It got replaced by this. Or that gas station's on the other corner. So I mean it's difficult to set a book in a real town because people are always going to say, oh, you're wrong about that. So but Mississippi influences my plots, I think, because the people I write about are Mississippians. And I grew up here, my family goes back 7 generations here. And it's just Mississippi's in my blood. And if I want to, I can start talking, like I'm a Mississippian again. It's not that far off, you know. So I think it influences my characters. And like when I took them far afield, it certainly influenced the plot. Because in Ireland, I got to have a castle, and cat, cat me if you can, or cat as cat can. Um, I was able to use Biltmore, work Biltmore into it a little bit, that kind of thing. Why the multiple pseudonyms? Well, marketing. Because when I first started out writing mysteries, my first 6 books were published by Dean James. And, you know, if you Google Dean James, what are you going to get? You're going to get a dead movie star, James Dean. So Dean James gets a little buried in there. Uh, so when I started my Trailer Park series, they wanted me to use a pseudonym. And so I did. And then when I wrote the 2 Bridge books, they wanted a different pseudonym. So I did that. And then, of course, for the Cat and Sacks books, they wanted another pseudonym. And they want, because the marketing people think the only people who read my books are women, which is not true. I mean, I get kids and, boys and girls and adult men and whatever. Oh, I read my books. And it's never been a secret. But, they wanted a pseudonym, and I wanted to keep my own last name. And then I chose Miranda because she's my favorite character from Shakespeare and my favorite play, The Tempest. And I actually had a character named Miranda in a previous series because I just love the name. I've always loved the name Miranda. To be wondered at. That's basically what it means from Latin. So, and then how I do research for law enforcement. Well, like I said, my cousin is very conveniently married to a sheriff's deputy here in Madison County, Mississippi. And so he's always good for questions. And for a long time, my late uncle was a lawyer and federal judge, and he was very happy to answer questions for me. And now, if I have a legal question, I can ask his son, who's also a lawyer. But I've kind of got a handle on police procedure and stuff in Mississippi, so I'm pretty comfortable with that. When I wrote the book in Ireland, I had to do a little research on the Gardaí, and look on the map where the clearest Gardaí station was and that kind of stuff. Because the book is set in County Clare, which is where I've been a couple times and stayed. So I wanted to make sure I got those details right, because if I didn't, somebody was going to tell me I was wrong. So far, nobody has. So. But it's, even if you don't luckily have a relative who is in law enforcement, a lot of times if you identify yourself and say, I'm writing a book, I'm writing a mystery, would you mind answering a few questions I have about procedure? And a lot of people, are very happy to share their expertise. They really are pleased to be able to talk about their jobs. So, suggestions for writing dialogue. Well, a lot of times I will stop and read aloud what I've written for the dialogue and make sure it sounds right. And my characters are for the most part educated. And so they use proper grammar. I had English teachers who drilled it all into me. And I still wince when I see a split infinitive or a sentence ending in a preposition and those kinds of things, which people take for granted these days. But, just write what you think the character sounds like. Now, I do not hear these people talking in my head, but when I read the dialogue aloud, it allows me to catch things which may sound a little pompous, or I can make a little more colloquial, that kind of thing. And, one of the dangers of writing dialogue with Southern sayings in them is that the copy editors, who all apparently seem to be from Maine or somewhere, flag them because they don't understand them. Whereas I don't even think twice, because they're ingrained in me, like, being written hard and put away wet. Is that one that really hard to figure out from the context? I don't think it is, but I got questions on that one, and stuff. And in one book I said, Care says, well, I'm going to slap the P-wad out of you, which is a very old Southern saying. And, I had to ask a friend who knows these things where it comes from. And it actually comes from an old Greek, some old Greek expression. I forgot the details. But in the South, that means you're really annoyed with somebody and you're going to slap them so hard the P-wad comes out. Whatever the P-wad is, I don't know. So, and don't go overboard with the colloquialisms, and don't try to do, dialect too much because editors will flag that because it can be a little bit too much and it can be a little bit confusing as well. So because I've read Golden Age mysteries with Cockney characters, and sometimes it gives you a headache trying to figure out what they're saying. So it's not as much of a thing these days. But my best suggestion is read it aloud to yourself and just see how it sounds. And does it fit what you think this character would sound like or how this character would say it? And sometimes, you come up with verbal tics for characters, but don't overuse them because you get to a point where you just want to slap the character and say, stop it. So use it sparingly. You know, like for years, I was bad about saying, at the end of every sentence. And I still do it occasionally, but one of my professors got it out of me for the longest time. And sometimes it comes back. So anything else?
While we wait for other questions, we have about 10 minutes left here. Do you
Okay.
have advice for aspiring authors looking to get published, looking to complete their first novel? Any advice?
Well, first of all, you're not going to sell it on 3 chapters if you're a first timer. You really have to have a complete book, you know. And I suggest, trying to get an agent if you want to be published by the mainstream publishers in New York. I really don't know much about the self-publishing or independent press publishing market because I've been lucky. I've been with Berkeley since 1994, and I also had a few books published by Kensington. And I did have a small press that published 3 books, and they were really good to work with. But um, try to get an agent if you can. And there are a lot of agents out there looking for people. Other thing is, don't write to a trend. I mean, right now, I'm so tired of going to the bookstore and seeing all these fantasy, romantasy novels. You know, I mean, it looks like everybody and their sister is writing one these days, and some of them are doing really, really well, and others are not. And I tried to read that Court of Thorn and Roses, and I gave up. I just could not do it. And that my cousins loved those books. But I was not the author, the audience for which they were intended. But write your book, write the book that entertains you, write the kind of book that you like to read. Because I think when you do that, you're really putting your heart into it. Because when you write something just for the market, it's kind of a clinical thing, I think. So write what you love and let that come through in what you're doing. So
That's great
and
advice.
persistence. Because it took me 25 years before I became an overnight sensation with the Katniss Sachs books. Because I kept at it. And luckily, I did have people at Berkeley who believed in me and supported me, which made a big difference. But you just have to keep trying. And if you get a bunch of rejections for one manuscript, then maybe it's time to write the next one. So don't beat the dead horse. And do not ask your family to read the book and give you advice because they're going to be afraid to hurt your feelings. I belonged to a critique group in Houston for a number of years before I moved back to Mississippi, and they were enormous help. Because there were Leanne Sweeney and Kay Finch were members of that group, and they both wrote excellent cozies and had excellent advice. And there were a couple of other people in there who really. A friend, Amy Sharp, who was the queen of logic, and she would tell you where your timeline went wrong. And, if she didn't think the logic made sense, she would tell you. So sometimes a critique group, if you can find a really good one, and if there's a person in it who doesn't really understand what you write and it's giving you bad advice, then you need to make that person leave. We had to do that in this critique group because we had a woman who wrote thrillers and she wasn't a very good writer. And she never read cozies, but she was always telling us that we needed to ramp up the tension in our books. Well, we're not writing thrillers, Yes, there is tension, but it's a totally different kind. So make sure you're with a group of people who understand what it is you're writing. So that's another thing. And the other one is how to write villains. Well, Uh, that's interesting. I mean, because mine are usually, I mean, they always have a secret agenda. You know, something has driven them to kill, and you need to find out what it is. And in a cozy, you know, those people need to look like they're not villains. You know, if you're writing a thriller, well, yeah, they can look like a villain. I mean, Hannibal Lecter was nothing but a villain. You know, but in a cozy, they need to be masking themselves. You know, as someone who is, you know, not going to be moved to violence to solve a problem. So that I think that's the key in a cozy. They need to look like everybody else and act like everybody else. But as you work through the story, little things begin to reveal themselves about this person, and then eventually it all comes out. So the powerful truth, one of my books, that actually nobody ever figured out the reference from the title because one of my all-time favorite movies is The Awful Truth with Cary Grant and Irene Dunn. I love the two of them. So I kind of based some of the dynamics of this plot on that movie. And then I used the character names and switched them around for my characters in the book. And I thought I was so clever, but I was, you know, a little too clever. But the villain in that one is one of those people who at first seems, you know, just fine, but slowly Charlie kind of begins to chip away at the facade, and the truth comes out in kind of a violent way in that book. That book has one of the most violent endings I've ever written. And Charlie deliberately puts himself in danger in order to provoke the killer, which I would not recommend doing in every book. So, you know, people get tired of that. But like I said, your villain needs to be somebody who looks like everybody else in Cozy and just gradually pull the veneer away.
Terrific. I think we have time for one last question. Anyone? Question? Otherwise, I'll ask one. Oh, okay. Give everyone a moment. All right. Okay. Uh, is there a book, and it's difficult because I know it's like asking your favorite child, but is there a book that you are particularly proud of having written? Or it could be a few. But
Well, I mean, a couple of my short stories I'm very, very proud of because they really achieved what I wanted to say in those books. And, you know, different books, Best Served Cold, which was the third book in the Wanted Elm, the Trailer Park series, I'm really fond of because that's the first book where I really got the subplot thing going. And that one really worked out exactly the way I wanted it to. And I think it's one of the best plots I've ever done. But I love the Charlie books. I love The Awful Truth, which is also a theatrical mystery. And I have been in a stage production, but that was as a musician. But I've always wanted to write a theatrical mystery because I love Niall Marsh's theatrical mysteries, you know, and stuff. And I'm very proud of the way that one worked out. And because I had to really figure out the timing of what's going on stage because the murder occurs on stage. So I'm proud of myself for doing that. And kudos to Niall Marsh, you know, for sort of giving me the experience to do it, you know. So, and I also love Arsenic and Old books a lot, you know, because I wrote entries from a Civil War diary that are interspersed in that book, and I think I did that well because I based it on Mary Chestnut's Civil War diary, which is a very famous Civil War diary. You know, I use that as my guide, and I think I can write in that voice rather well. So, because I've read so many Victorian novels, I can ape the style pretty well. So, I think those are some of my favorites. Now, my all-time favorite mystery is a book called The Tiger in the Smoke by Marjorie Allingham, which is an absolutely brilliant thriller. You know, and next after that would probably be Crocodile and the Sandbag by Elizabeth Peters, which I've read a number of times. Absolutely love that book. So that kind of gives you my reading taste.
well, thank you so much for your time. I see you have several thank yous here. Um, yeah. Oh, Liz Irish, Arsenic and Old Books was your first book I read, hooked me on the series.
Oh,
So
well, thank you, Liz.
yeah,
And
so
thanks to Kathleen, too.
Yeah.
I,
Thank you.
you know, thank you all for having me. I can talk for hours, so as long as my voice goes out. So I appreciate the very good questions.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we were thrilled to have you as our guest, and you have kicked off our 2026 programming with a bang. Yeah, you set us off
Thank
for
you. Appreciate that.
wonderful. And thank you
Thank you.
so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And Dean has been gracious enough to allow us to post this video on YouTube. So if you want to revisit some of the questions, some of what he said, it will be available probably within a week or so. And yeah, you'll see it on our website and on the homepage. Yeah, so thank you everyone, and have a good rest of the day until our February program. And thank you again, Dean. Take care,
And
everyone.
Jenna, for the applause. Bye bye.